Hi, everyone. Just want to say first thanks to HL7 for having us present today, and thanks for everybody staying throughout the 5 p.m. hour almost, or 4 p.m., whatever it is here in New Orleans. So I also want to thank James Agnew, who is with Simpatico and the developer of the Smile CDR, which we'll talk a little bit about today. James and I are going to tag team today, so you'll bear with us as we pass the microphone back and forth, but thanks everyone. So in full transparency in your program, it reads that I am Dr. Les Leonard. Unfortunately, Dr. Leonard could not be here today, so I am not he. I am Ken Deans. I serve as the president and CEO of Health Sciences South Carolina. But the great news is I did stay in the JW Marriott last night, so I'm feeling pretty clinical. And so if you need any diagnosis assistance, particularly the clots from sitting here all afternoon, come talk to me and I'm sure I can figure something out for you. So typically we technologists are not really all that funny, or at least that's been my experience, so I apologize for bad jokes like the last one as we go throughout the presentation. All right, so a little bit about health sciences, and you'll notice the depiction of the state of South Carolina there. We were the first statewide health data and research collaborative established about a decade ago in South Carolina. We really have worked across the Carolinas to create a learning health system. The foundation of the system is built upon an interinstitutional culture of collaboration, which sometimes is hard to achieve. We've been fairly successful there. We're pretty proud of that. And so today we want to share a little bit with you about what FHIR means to us in some of the work we do. We'll really kind of go through our current state and future state, mixing in there some of the challenges and why we think the Smile CDR product coupled with FHIR can have an impact for us. So this is a pretty busy slide. If you will follow it from left to right, I'll kind of walk through it very high level, but this is our current data architecture. So you'll see here on the left of your screen where data comes into the data warehouse. Then it'll flow over into our operational data store with an EMPI, which goes into a translational volume and transactional volume where we convert files nightly into the CDW, and this is an HL7 v3 RIM-like clinical data model. Products are anonymized for research, and I2B2 is the face for all of the data on the research side, and then data is available in a identified basis for clinical purposes. So if you'll focus your attention to the middle of the screen there, that's really where some of our challenges presently exist. So our EMPI is very robust, well over 4 million patients in the database, about 4.5 million actually. However, the data store that you see in the middle of the screen really can't keep up with the transactions in real time. We've never fully got to the point of using the operational data store for applications, which was part of our strategy and historical goals. It was just too difficult. So we've really always intended to have live data patient-centric store be the architecture of this system. And so this really then kind of offers a translational scenario or transformative scenario of where we want to go. So if you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see kind of the current state. It's an information resource for research. So centralized databases you saw, we talked about the data model. Periodic database releases go through the process. There was a pretty substantial governance process put in place. As you can imagine, that took almost as long as building the infrastructure. And then export with the final goal of that data going to analytics and into separate platforms. So the future of where we want to go is really an information platform for full collaboration. And this is where we really consider a federated model coming into place. We're seeking an API for access by the EHRs and other apps. We really want, research master ID integrated with the institutional data, as you see here, and ultimately utilizing Odyssey's OMAP format to get to the analytics. So with that, I'll hand it over to James.
Thank you. So I'm hoping some of you guys are familiar with FHIR, which is, of course, one of the reference implementations of the FHIR specification. A few years ago, a few of us who are sort of working on FHIR, some of the core developers of that product, got together and decided, let's try and form sort of a commercial entity around that. So the genesis of that, of course, is Smile CDR. We are an entity providing a clinical data repository, sort of a set of services on top of FHIR, as well as a repository that stores data. We launched this back in 2016 and actually spoke at the last FHIR Apps Roundtable, which is oddly enough where our two organizations met. So who knew there would be a love story right here at the FHIR Apps Roundtable? Kind of an interesting thing. And I mean, it's been happy ever since. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem that we're sort of jointly setting out to solve. I've personally, and I think our organization, much like Ken's, have been sort of working in the health space for a long time. And I mean, one of the challenges I've seen over and over again is this sort of pattern of the health system having these two divides of clinical and research data. Your clinical systems in a typical health organization, of course, are fairly well integrated with HL7 version 2. That's a fairly popular pattern. And typically sitting over on the other side of the wall are a whole bunch of research databases and research systems, which typically act as little islands. Generally, there's not a whole lot of communication between the two in sort of an operational sense. And where there is, it's typically manual processes as opposed to sort of automatic and, good data flow between the two systems. So we've been plagued by that problem at many institutions over the years. Beaming that up to sort of the statewide level, of course, things get harder because a bunch of divided systems really don't integrate well when you want to try and do things at the aggregate level across the entire state. So this has been a challenge that we've set out to try and come up with a new type of solution to. I can't talk about things like this without an architecture diagram. So this is that architecture diagram sort of showing off the solution we've put together. Taking this one from left to right, essentially what we've done is set up a bunch of site-specific CDRs. So each participating hospital within the network has a single CDR which stores a bunch of clinical data for that institution. Part of the architecture of Smile CDR is a set of HL7 version 2 ingesters. So in real time or near real time, we're ingesting things like ADT and ORU feeds, mapping them into FHIR, and then storing them in a bunch of CDRs for sort of clinical consumption. Based on the data we collect in those institutional CDRs, we sort of aggregate the data up into a number of other data assets. One is a central CDR, which keeps sort of a replicated copy of a few key pieces of data from the site CDRs in easily queryable formats. Another is populating an enterprise master person index for of course, cross-referencing between the CDRs. And then naturally, we've got a bunch of data lakes which are able to sort of aggregate that data and present it for research purposes. All of this is powered, oddly enough, by the power of FHIR subscriptions, where we're basically sort of subscribing the assets on the right to the assets on the left using the native capabilities of FHIR for subscription, which we've thought is pretty cool.
Yeah, and so ultimately the goal there with that architecture is really to preserve the independence of the multi-institutional data. It's to create an efficient, more effective access without centralizing and reduplicating everything into one central repository, as you see here. So really, the EMPI allows deduplications across the CDR, so each hospital can enrich the data, and their data remains proprietary to them. So again, here, just really more of that last slide. This allows us to extend data into localized forms. So we can maintain a variety of data marts while really staying in sync in a real-time scenario. And this is really what we are phrasing as subscriptions because we can maintain multiple data marts without, doing production ETL at whatever frequency is typically necessary. It's much more quick, robust, and scalable. So in partnering with James's Smile CDR and using FHIR, we can cost effectively maintain multiple formats, marts, and so forth. And which, by the way, includes, as I mentioned earlier, Odyssey's OMOP. So here again is just a pictorial example of how OMOP, CDM, a common data model plus standardized vocabulary come together, really allowing for desired analytics and collaborations. One more pictorial showing how ultimately this really leads to not just analytics, but meaningful information, particularly as we all move into pop health and other quality fabrics of our institutions.
So naturally, once we've got all this data flowing into data lakes, we've sort of solved a really interesting problem. But the fact that we've got all of these institutional CDRs exposing a bunch of really useful and sort of near real-time data allows us a whole sort of class of new interesting application on top of it. Taking advantage of the power of Smart on FHIR applications, we've started to build Smart on FHIR applications which really leverage that data, interestingly, sort of at the state level, so across institutions as opposed to against a single EHR. The first one we've looked at as sort of a candidate for that has been this smart app that we've built that sort of shows an aggregate condition and encounter list for an individual patient, taking advantage of the MPI to cross-reference between CDRs and then fetching data from each of those CDRs to show it in one aggregate list. That's the first example. The second example, and I've got a screenshot of it here, has been an ED notification application. The idea being there that a doctor can subscribe to patients they're specifically worried about, all powered by FHIR subscriptions, and then be notified when any emerge visit gets created across any of the CDRs that sort of have a subscription registered in them. The way that looks, of course, is we're flowing various encounters into a CDR. We've got the native FHIR subscription engine generating emails, and then a Smart on FHIR app that sits on top of it, which manages alert subscriptions for individual users.
And again, that was just an example of enriching the data subscriptions. So, it's really been my experience in healthcare that we have a lot of data, but frequently I think we find in health systems across the nation that we don't necessarily always have a lot of information from that data. So if you subscribe to the notion that data leads to information if meaningfully used, and information ultimately leads to knowledge, then this is where our tools can really have a pretty significant impact. So the intention then is to build out tools that allow members to subscribe to both public and private information sources, which you see here, allowing those CDRs to produce data that's more valuable. If it's been said before that if clinicians' hands save lives, which is true, so do the tools that we put into them. So here lies an example of what a subscription might look like. This is a depiction of environmental sensors and the relationship between asthma admissions and different types of particulate matter, effectively the particles in the air and the areas in which they live. One more example here for you is correlating obesity rates with the walk score of patients and allowing to bring public data in to make it available within the application. And so future plans really is just to expand our scope as we have here. You see the difference between the current scope. Some areas we have under development include laboratory, medication orders administration, and additional hospital inputs as well. And then our discoveries. FHIR is our new best friend. Relationships built right here, right? And so it really will power all of our interactions. So everything on FHIR makes a great architecture, and so that is ultimately the goal, is to get away from flat, stale data to near real-time production and use of multiple disparate systems data. I think that's it, so thank you very much.